Despite Bandai's chronic inability to print to demand, I managed to get into the Gundam trading card game, and as there is actually a small local scene nearby, I've been playing it quite a bit lately. I am a big fan of Gundam in general, although my initial read on the rules of this game didn't impress me much. More on that later. I did end up actually quite enjoying the game. To start, let me briefly go over how to play. Gundam uses a 50-card deck with a 4 of maximum, and a 10-card resource deck. On top of that, you'll need dice and a lot of different tokens. Your deck can contain a maximum of 2 different colors. To start a game, determine who goes first, shuffle your deck, then draw 5 cards. You have 1 mulligan, where you can place the cards in your hand on the bottom of your deck and then draw 5 more cards, and then you shuffle the deck. Once you have your starting hand, deal out 6 cards from the top of your deck face down as your shields, and place your EX base token above them. Bases act like an additional shield with an HP value attached. You can only have one of them in play at a time. The EX base is a default base that you begin the game with, and you can play out additional bases from your main deck as you draw them. Finally, if you're going second, you also put out an EX resource. More on how this works when we get to how to play out cards from your hand. Turns begin with a start phase where you activate all of your rested cards. This is the ever familiar untap step. Then you draw 1 card from the deck, and next, if there are any cards in your resource deck, you play one of those out to your resource area. From there, you just have a wide open main phase where you can do pretty much anything else until you decide to move on to the end phase and finish the turn. Getting a bit more into the main phase, you can play out cards by resting resources and attack with units. To play a card in Gundam, you need to check both the level and the cost. The first number, the level, is the number of resources you have to have in your resource area to play the card. The cost is the number of those resources that you need to rest in order to play the card. So, for example, the gym is a level 2 cost 1 unit. The first turn player couldn't have played it on their first turn, since although they had enough resources to cover the cost, they didn't have enough total resources in play to match the level. This is where the EX resource from earlier comes in. When you rest it to pay a cost, it is discarded afterwards, but as long as it's in play, it will count towards your total level, which means that we can play the gym on our first turn with no problem by resting our regular resource. This actually gives a very strong advantage to the player going second, which is the opposite of how it usually is in card games. Units are not able to attack the turn that they're played unless they're equipped with their linked pilot. To see what that means, let's jump ahead a bit. So here we have played the Gundam Aegis, and we have a pilot card in our hand. There are 2 types of pilot equips. You can pair a pilot to any unit, which will give that unit a power-up and often a new ability. This is the base level equip, but most units also have a specific link pilot at the bottom of the card. As mentioned, link units can attack the turn that they are deployed, and they'll often gain some bonus abilities as well. For example, when Athrun is linked to a unit, that unit is able to attack active units during this turn. Since it's linked with Athrun, the Aegis that we just played this turn is able to attack right away, so we'll go ahead and see how combat works. You begin the attack by resting the attacking unit and then choosing where to attack. You can target either a resting enemy unit or the enemy's shields. If you're attacking the opponent's shields, you will either deal damage equal to the attacker's power to the base, or if there's no base in play, you just go ahead and destroy the shield. When a shield is destroyed, you flip it face up, and if it has a burst effect, you can activate that effect, and then whether or not it had a burst, the card is then sent to the trash. If you're attacking a unit, like in this case, each unit deals damage equal to their power to the other, and then any units with equal or more damage to their HP are destroyed. In Gundam, damage doesn't clear at the end of the turn. It stays on the unit until the unit is destroyed, so it's important to track damage with dice or damage counters. In this case, the 4/6 Aegis has defeated the 2/2 Jim, but it's taken 2 damage in the process. The Aegis has an additional ability on it as well, Breach 3, which means that when it destroys an enemy unit, it deals 3 damage to the opposing player. If there's a base, like in this case, it'll deal that damage to the base. And if there's no base, the damage will instead go through and destroy a shield. And with that, our turn is finished, so we'll pass the turn back over to the opponent. Play will continue back and forth until one player receives an attack while they have no shields and no base to defend them. One final note on the base rules, there is a very limited window to play cards on your opponent's turn. Abilities and command cards that have an action timing can be played just before damage is dealt during an attack, and also, if you don't run into an opportunity to play them at any other point in the turn, you can just go ahead and play them at the end of the turn as well. Another important note is that blocking is a keyword action in Gundam, and by default your units aren't able to intercept the opponent's attacks. As I mentioned at the start, my first read of Gundam's rules didn't really impress me all that much, and even now, after playing it a lot, I can still say that while I definitely enjoy it and it's a solid game, I'm also not going to be giving it any awards for originality. Gundam is basically Duel Masters with pilots. The level and limit distinction feels like it was designed to give pilots a convenient space to slide in. Most units cost their level -1 or 2, and most pilots have a reasonably high level, but a cost of only 1. That convenient cost space between units and pilots, as well as the link benefits they provide, means that basically all decks are going to want to run some number of pilot cards. Given the inherent card disadvantage of equip mechanics, the fact that you very much want to pair up pilots and units in this game feels like the game's very much succeeded in its objective, and it's done so in a slightly more interesting way than just building in some kind of card advantage mechanic, like many other games have done when they're trying to make their equips work. A few other tweaks further refine the game and smooth out a few of the potential rough spots, like the EX resource to balance out the first turn advantage, and the EX base to offer a bit of early protection against aggressive aggro starts. Playing resources from a resource deck instead of your hand also gives you more cards in hand to work with in the later stages of the game, which is nice, although the game does end up in a top deck war surprisingly often. Even with all of these changes to the formula, though, this does still feel like one of the more direct Duel Masters clones. And that's honestly a fine place for a game to end up, and given Duel Masters isn't widely available outside of Japan, it's really not an issue here, since the system does play very well. There are 2 main areas where I think the game doesn't work quite as well, though, and one should be pretty obvious given the game's strong Duel Masters inspiration. While Duel Masters has had very few 1-cost units, Gundam already has something of a 1-cost problem. To summarize an earlier video I did on the topic, 1-cost cards have a very strong cost advantage relative to any other cost, to the point that they are very difficult to balance. This is especially pronounced in Duel Masters style shield life systems, since every unit is going to deal a fixed amount of damage to the opposing player, regardless of how much they cost. In Gundam, aggressive decks built around the plentiful level 2 1-cost 2/2s are very strong in the current meta. Duel Masters has very few 1-cost cards, and most are either quite weak or very situational, and specifically can't be used for fast aggro starts. While I like the idea of being able to spam grunt units or focus on more powerful protagonist suits, and it's really not a huge problem right now, it does feel like these aggressive spam decks are already extremely strong, even if most 1-cost units are 2/2 vanillas. It has definitely already started forcing players to focus on lower cost cards as the core of their strategies, and every efficient 1-cost card that the game introduces is just going to make these low-cost rush strategies even more dangerous. The cat is already halfway out of the bag, and the designers are going to have to be very careful going forward. Another problem I want to highlight here is color balance. White gets blockers and card filtering, while other colors have some options for both. None of the alternatives are anywhere close to white's efficiency and utility. The Strike Kira package of blocker units is one of the strongest packages available in the game right now, and is slotted into almost any deck planning on reaching the late game. Overflowing Affection is probably the single most important card in the game right now. In a game that so heavily rewards pairing units and their pilots, low-cost consistency pieces that let you dig for these combos is a pretty invaluable effect that no other color, other than white, really has great options for right now. At the moment, it really does feel like most decks are either running white blockers for defense, Amuro Ray for offense, or both at once, leading to a meta that is heavily skewed towards white and blue. I wouldn't really consider this a problem, but I do want to squeeze in a mention here that a lot of the cards feel very basic so far. I was recently talking to someone who described it as feeling a bit like block constructed in Magic, and I think that's a pretty fair observation. So far, it's not very flashy, and even in Set 2, their approach to effect design still feels very conservative. This isn't bad, necessarily, it's still very early in the game, and it's nice to let the core mechanics have a little bit of breathing room before the complexity really starts ramping up. But if you're someone who lives and breathes complexity in card games, this might seem just a little bit too simple and straightforward, at least for the moment. One final complaint that is really more of a note of caution for anyone looking to get into the game is the depressing constant with Bandai trading card games. Finding product is a nightmare. No matter the game, except Battle Spirit Saga, Bandai has consistently been overly conservative with their print runs, and in Gundam this is especially a huge problem for the starter decks, which have multiple important staple cards and are being scalped to a frankly insane degree. The booster supply for Set 1 seems to have more or less evened out, and Set 2, apart from its initial launch, seems to have evened out as well, although the prices on sealed product are still heavily inflated. Single prices, however, have also stabilized at fairly reasonable and, in some cases, even cheap levels relative to other trading card games. But as far as looking ahead, Set 3 and 4, and basically all of the starter decks that come along with those sets, are already showing availability problems, and it looks like this is still going to be an issue for the foreseeable future. Before I wrap up, I want to come back to a comparison that I've been thinking a lot about lately. Both Gundam and One Piece are Bandai games that are obviously heavily modeled after the Duel Masters style of game system, and of the two I honestly think that One Piece is a stronger game. I'm not really satisfied with my first video on the One Piece TCG, but with Gundam as a point of comparison, it's really easy to see just how much One Piece really got right. 2 resources per turn really does feel much better than 1, and it gives a lot more room for nuance in card costs, and much less space for 1-cost units to be overwhelming. In fact, with the leader cards at a base 5k power in One Piece, nearly all 1-cost cards are just consistency pieces. In One Piece, it also takes less time to get to the maximum 10 resources, and you spend less time on low resource turns, meaning that decks have a much better diversity of card cost overall. Additionally, resources being equipable for a power boost on attack and being able to discard cards to give a power boost on defense means that you don't end turns with resources left unspent, and you often don't end the game with cards stranded in your hand that you were never able to use. Going from this system to Gundam, where you do often end up leaving resources unused, and it's easy to lose the game with several cards you weren't able to deploy from your hand, is definitely a bit jarring. Even something as simple as the first turn penalty of only playing 1 resource on your first turn instead of the usual 2 feels like a more natural fix to the first turn advantage than the EX resources, which feels a little more stapled on. To be fair, the EX resource does its job quite well, it just feels a little less elegant. One Piece does a lot right, and purely as a game system, I do feel like it is noticeably better than Gundam. One huge advantage that Gundam does have over most of its TCG peers is a simultaneous global release. Nearly every Japanese game in English, and a good deal of English games being released into Japan, have notable release lags, which can really sap a lot of excitement from the game. It's a lot less fun exploring new strategies if it feels like the format was mostly solved months ago in another country, and you're mostly just copying their homework. With the entire global community discovering cards as they release, it's really made deck building and theory crafting a lot more fun for this game than I've had in quite a while. It's been really interesting watching in real time how nearly every time the meta has felt solved, a new deck just shows up and shakes things up. At first, blue-white blockers felt nearly unassailable, but then blue-green aggro really started pushing back hard. In fact, the aggro deck, without any blockers at all, was so fast and powerful, it felt like the other decks really couldn't keep up. But more recent tournaments have had strong showings from white-green, featuring the 8-cost sweeper Wing 0. And through it all, red-blue ping and white-red justice decks seem to keep chugging along, keeping pace with these developments, although perhaps a tier lower. It's been a surprisingly dynamic meta for Set 1, and although Set 2 is feeling like things are starting to settle a bit, it does still feel like there's a decent variety of viable options to choose from in this game. Overall, I'm still quite enjoying the Gundam card game. While low-cost aggro and white blocker decks right now are definitely the format boogeyman, there is a variety of different strategies that all feel at least somewhat viable, and every time the meta feels solved, a new deck has shown up and shaken things up, so things haven't been too stale so far. On a more general note, Gundam has a very deep pool of characters and mobile suits to pull from, so I can see it being an easy game to maintain over the long term, unlike One Piece or Dragon Ball with their dozens of Luffys and dozens of Gokus. While Gundam may not be quite as good mechanically as One Piece, being a decent Duel Masters clone is still a pretty fine place to be, and the game is fun and engaging with a lot of different characters and strategies to explore. Plus, there's giant robots, Char Aznable, and angry cotton candy. What more could anyone want from a game?